Welcome, friends, to this installment of Take 5. And before I launch into a little bit of reflection on the scripture passage that I read this morning, my own reading time, I'd like just to encourage you to do something this week. And that is get outside and look at the leaves. Get out and look at the leaves. Unless, of course, like you're watching this from, say, Florida or Antarctica or someplace where you don't have any leaves. But otherwise, someone once said, theologians have said that God has revealed himself to us in two main books. This book, the scriptures, but also the book that is his creation. And it just seems to me that this fall in our area, the trees, that aspect of God's creation, just so beautiful, and it does something good for your soul to get out and avail yourself of that. Well, as for scripture, I mentioned before that for this stretch of time, my own reflections are coming from a Moody Bible Institute resource called Today in the Word. And all this month, it has us in book 2 of the Psalms, which is Psalms 42 to 72. And today's reading that I read this morning was Psalm 56. And you know how the Psalms have little headings on them? Well, the headings the Jews believed were as inspired as the Psalm itself, as the words of the Psalm. And this one, it says it's a David Psalm. It says it's to a certain tune that we have no idea what it is. And then it says, when the Philistines had seized him in Gath. Now, this then harkens back to the time when David was on the run from Saul. And at this point, he had gone into Philistine territory, which is Israel's enemy, and specifically to the town of Gath. And we read about this in 1 Samuel about this period of time. Now, Gath was Goliath's hometown. And so here he is in Gath, and 1 Samuel also tells us that he went there alone. He had 600 men generally that were with him during this period, but they hadn't caught up with him yet. So he goes there alone from the town of Nob, where he picked up a weapon. And the weapon he picked up was Goliath's sword, the sword that he'd used to cut off Goliath's head. So here's David. He's in Goliath's hometown with Goliath's sword all by himself. And I was thinking of those old Southwest Airlines commercials where, they have somebody in a really awkward place, like a lady going into a men's bathroom, and all these men come in and says, "Whoa, want to get away?" Well, that's kind of David here wanting to get away. And so after he asks God to be merciful to him, and he describes his situation a little bit, he says this in verse 3. He says, when I am afraid, I will trust in you. When I'm afraid, I will trust in you. And there's a great declaration there on a couple of fronts. For one, it seems to me, here's David, this mighty warrior king, admitting that he's afraid, that he is afraid. And some of us are more prone to being afraid than others, but fear is a pretty standard universal human emotion. All of us have are at times fearful. Some people, like David, are afraid of bodily harm from enemies. David also seems here to be afraid that his reputation is going to be damaged by the Philistines. And some of us maybe are more afraid of that, of our reputations being damaged, than we are bodily harm from enemies. But folks are afraid of all kinds of things. People are afraid of snakes, afraid of the dentist, afraid of the dark. Today, people are fearful of contracting COVID. People are afraid of what the future may hold. One of the big fears I hear from people is a fear of ending up alone. Well, David here, he admits to God that he's afraid, and so can we. But he doesn't stop there, does he? He says, when I am afraid, I will trust in you. And then a line that's repeated twice in the psalm, in verse 4 and then again in verse 10, he says, I will trust in you, in God whose word I praise. In God I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me? And David reminds himself of two truths about God that make God worthy of his trust. First of all, that God is powerful. In verse 7, it is here, he talks about God as the one who can take down nations. And then at the end of it, in verse 13, God is the one who can deliver him from any situation, even death, which at the moment seems very, very likely to him. So David reminds himself of God is powerful, and then he reminds himself of God's care for him. Listen to what it says in verse 8. He says, record my laments, and he's speaking to God. List my fears or my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record. Notice he's the God who knows and cares about David's tears, about the deepest concerns of his heart. And he knows about this for you and for me too, friends. And so in light of God's power, in light of God's compassion, David can then say twice in this psalm, "In God I trust, I will not be afraid. In God I trust, I will not be afraid." Well, and what can man do to me? Was the Moody commentator in the section that I read today said on this. He said, well, actually, people can do a lot to us. Human beings can do much damage to one another. But the point here is that David knew that God had planned and destined him to be Israel's king. And the Philistines weren't powerful enough to thwart what God had planned for his life. Well, friends, fear it's a normal part of life in this world. And there's a lot to be afraid of, which is probably why one of the most repeated mantras in Scripture, about 365 times, one for every day, is what? It's fear not. Why? Well, because nothing that we fear, even if it's something that kills us, can thwart God's good plan for us either, friends. I think in the New Testament version of David's refrain here, it's in Romans 8:31. It says, "God is for us, who can be against us?" Well, friends, in sending Jesus into the world and sending him to the cross and raising him from the dead, God has shown that he is indeed for you. And so whatever you might feel is against you today, whatever it is that you might be afraid of, nothing, friends, can thwart his good plan for your life here and certainly for your life in the world to come. Well, thanks, friends. May God bless you real well today. Bye for now.